From crowded tenement streets to hidden back rooms where power was traded in whispers and contracts, one man reshaped the criminal world without ever firing the first shot. Born with nothing, raised in chaos and sharpened by survival, he learned early that control was built through networks, discipline, and timing. While others fought for territory, he designed systems. While rivals chased fear, he engineered loyalty. His influence stretched from docks and unions to courts and prisons, even when iron bars closed around him. This is the story of how organization replaced disorder, how strategy replaced instinct, and how one architect quietly built an empire that outlived him. The story of Lucky Luciano is more than just the rise of a criminal mastermind, it's the birth of modern organized crime itself. For decades, the name Luciano has echoed through the annals of criminal history, a symbol of both power and peril, a legend built on a complex mix of charisma, ruthless ambition, and strategic genius. In the shadows of history, this Sicilian-born immigrant transformed the American underworld, his name forever intertwined with the birth of the Mafia as we know it. Yet, as powerful and omnipresent as his legacy remains, Luciano's life was not just one of brutality and crime. It was a profound journey of survival, reinvention, and the quest for control in a world that demanded both respect and fear. But how did a boy who started with nothing, born into poverty and struggling to find his place in a new land, evolve into the man who would become the most powerful figure in organized crime history? What forces shaped him, what challenges did he face, and how did he rise above them all to command the loyalty and fear of an entire criminal empire? In this exploration of Luciano's life, we are not just recounting a history of crime, we are uncovering the roots of a man who would become the architect of a criminal legacy that would span generations. Luciano's life and the era in which he lived were defined by a unique set of circumstances: immigration, poverty, prohibition, and a growing sense of disillusionment with the American dream. Born in Sicily in 1897, Luciano's early life was marked by hardship, the same hardship that had driven millions of immigrants to America in the hopes of finding something better. But what they found in New York City was often a harsh reality: crime-ridden streets, overcrowded tenements, and a society that viewed them as little more than outsiders regardless of their potential. It was in these gritty streets, amidst the noise and chaos of early 20th century New York, that Luciano would learn the rules of survival. Immigrants in New York faced immense challenges. They were often seen as second-class citizens, struggling to make a living in an environment that was far from welcoming. For many, crime became the most viable option, an entry point into a world where power was derived not from birthright but from control of the streets. And for young Luciano, crime was not just a means to an end, it was the gateway to an entirely new identity, one built on respect, fear, and power. By the age of 14, Luciano was already involved in petty crime, mostly small-time hustling and street scams. But unlike many of the others in his community who engaged in similar activities, Luciano had an innate sense of strategy. He understood that survival in this world wasn't just about strength, it was about creating a network of allies, building trust, and consolidating power. Where others saw disorganization, Luciano saw opportunity. He recognized the fractured nature of the immigrant underworld and understood that there was a more efficient, more organized way to operate. It was this visionary outlook that would eventually set him apart from the rest, but it would take years of careful maneuvering and bloody conflict to transform his vision into reality. Luciano was no stranger to violence. He witnessed firsthand the ruthlessness of the world he inhabited, the murders, the backstabbing, the betrayals. But he also understood something others often overlooked. Violence was a tool, not a way of life. For Luciano, the key to power was not in brutal force alone, but in the manipulation of those around him. He knew how to play people, how to work both sides of the street, using his charm and intellect to win over enemies and build a network of loyal supporters. In a world where betrayal was common and alliances were fragile, Luciano's ability to read people and predict their actions became one of his most valuable assets. As he rose through the ranks of New York's criminal underworld, Luciano began to forge connections with key figures in the Mafia. He aligned himself with other ambitious young men like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, individuals who shared his vision of turning crime into a highly organized, business-like operation. Together, they would challenge the traditional, chaotic methods of mobsters like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two powerful figures who dominated the New York Mafia landscape in the early 1930s. But Luciano was no ordinary gangster, and his ambition knew no bounds. He saw the future of the Mafia, and it wasn't in fragmented rival crime families, it was in a unified, centralized organization. By this time, Luciano had already proven himself as a brilliant strategist, earning respect from both his allies and enemies alike. However, the time had come for him to take his place at the top. In a brutal and carefully orchestrated series of moves, Luciano would orchestrate the downfall of Masuria and Maranzano, the two men who controlled the New York Mafia. It was a bloody struggle, one that would forever alter the course of criminal history. With their deaths, Luciano secured his dominance, and the groundwork was laid for what would become the Commission, a governing body that would bring order to the chaotic world of organized crime. But Luciano was more than just a crime boss, he was a visionary. He realized that crime could be more than just violence and extortion, it could be a profitable, structured enterprise. He organized the Mafia like a corporation, managing everything from gambling operations to unions, from bootlegging to labor rackets. Luciano's Mafia was no longer a loose collection of gangs fighting for territory, it was a well-oiled machine, operating on principles of business efficiency and mutual respect. Under his leadership, the Mafia became more powerful and profitable than ever before. Despite his success, Luciano's rise to power was not without its costs. Betrayal and loyalty played constant roles in the delicate web of alliances Luciano built around him. The same ruthless ambition that had driven him to the top also made him vulnerable to those who sought to bring him down. It was this tension between loyalty and betrayal, between trust and paranoia, that would ultimately lead to Luciano's downfall. In 1936, after years of carefully crafted alliances and carefully maintained secrecy, Luciano's empire was suddenly and unexpectedly threatened. Federal agents, working in tandem with local law enforcement, finally brought him down. His arrest was a blow to the Mafia, but it was also a victory for the government. For the first time, they had captured the mastermind behind the criminal empire that had once seemed untouchable. But even behind bars, Luciano's influence didn't wane. He continued to control his empire from prison, using intermediaries and his loyal allies to maintain a grip on his criminal empire. He had outsmarted the government once again, refusing to let his incarceration diminish his power. Eventually, however, his criminal activities would catch up with him. In 1946, after serving a lengthy prison sentence, Luciano was deported to Italy. The man who had once ruled the streets of New York with an iron fist was now in exile, stripped of his power and forced to live in a foreign land. But even in exile, Luciano's influence was far from over. He attempted to re-establish his criminal empire in Europe, but by then his power had begun to fade. The world he had built was no longer the same, and his legacy was slowly slipping away. Despite his fading power, Luciano's impact on organized crime remains undeniable. His methods, his vision, and his ability to create a centralized, business-like organization revolutionized the Mafia and influenced future generations of criminals. But perhaps the greatest legacy Luciano left behind was the myth of Lucky Luciano himself. The story of a man who, against all odds, rose from the streets to the pinnacle of power, only to fall from grace in the most dramatic of ways. A man who embodied the contradictions of the American dream, driven by ambition, yet haunted by betrayal. A man who would forever be remembered as the Godfather before the Godfathers. Before the rise of Lucky Luciano, the Mafia was a fractured, chaotic collection of crime families, each operating independently, often at odds with one another. The world of organized crime was not yet the tightly controlled, business-like operation that Luciano would eventually create. Instead, it was a disjointed system of power struggles, territory wars, and betrayals. The Mafia structure was one of violence and unpredictability, a far cry from the organized empire that Luciano would later build. In many ways, the disarray of the pre-Luciano Mafia was a mirror of the larger societal unrest that plagued early 20th century America. The story of organized crime before Luciano is one of struggle, division, and disillusionment. At the turn of the century, crime in America was a reflection of the country itself. Immigrants from all over the world coming together in an unfamiliar land, desperate for opportunity but often finding only oppression. For many Italian immigrants, the path to success was not through traditional means but through the criminal underworld. The Mafia, or Cosa Nostra as it would later be known, was one of the most well-established networks for Italian immigrants to rise above the poverty and prejudice that defined their lives. Yet even within this criminal world, there was no unity. In New York City, particularly in the Lower East Side, crime was rampant. The Italian immigrants who settled here were often forced to fight for control of the streets, struggling to maintain their dignity in a world that viewed them as little more than outsiders. The violence was not just a byproduct of poverty, but also a product of a system that was unregulated and chaotic. Each gang, each crime family, operated independently, their goals often conflicting with one another. There was no structure, no unifying force that could bring the many factions together. Instead, the Mafia was a fractured web of crime lords vying for control of territory, power, and wealth. During this time, the Mafia was ruled by powerful men like Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, two of the most influential crime bosses in New York. Their rivalry, rooted in differing visions of the Mafia's future, would come to define the early years of organized crime in America. Masuria represented the old-school approach to crime, violent, unpredictable, and chaotic. He was a traditionalist who believed in brute force and intimidation, using violence as a tool to expand his influence. Maranzano, on the other hand, represented the more modern, structured approach. He believed in creating a more organized, business-like mafia, one that could operate with more efficiency and less chaos. But despite their differences, both men had one thing in common. They each sought to consolidate power over the other. This power struggle between Masuria and Maranzano would eventually set the stage for Luciano's rise. In many ways, Luciano's early life was shaped by the brutality of these two powerful figures and the violence that permeated the Mafia underworld. As a young man, Luciano witnessed firsthand the bloodshed that defined the era: mob wars, turf battles, and the constant cycle of betrayal. The world he inhabited was one where survival often depended on alliances, but those alliances were fragile at best. The slightest misstep could lead to betrayal, and betrayal was often met with death. This was the world into which Luciano was born. A world in which power was fragmented, loyalty was tenuous, and violence was the language of the streets. It was a world that needed someone who could bring order to the chaos, someone who could create a new kind of structure within the underworld. Luciano, with his sharp mind and ambitious nature, was that person. He saw the fractured state of the Mafia as an opportunity, a gap that he could fill with his vision of a more organized, business-minded approach to crime. But before he could impose his will on the Mafia, Luciano had to navigate the treacherous waters of the existing power struggles. He had to deal with the violence, the shifting alliances, and the constant threat of betrayal. At first, Luciano was just another player in the game, a young man who worked his way up through the ranks of the Mafia by aligning himself with powerful figures like Masuria and Maranzano. He understood early on that in order to gain power, he needed to build relationships, not just with the old guard but with the new generation of crime bosses who were beginning to emerge. One of the key relationships that helped shape Luciano's future was his alliance with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster who was also looking to carve out his place in the criminal world. Together they saw the potential for a more organized, efficient mafia, one that could rival the power of the old-school bosses like Masuria and Maranzano. Lansky brought a level of sophistication and business acumen to the partnership, while Luciano's street smarts and ruthlessness provided the muscle. Together, they formed the foundation of what would eventually become a global criminal empire. But even as Luciano began to build his network of allies, the chaos of the Mafia world was never far behind. The rivalry between Masuria and Maranzano escalated, and the violence that ensued would set the stage for Luciano's most significant move, the elimination of both men. In many ways, Luciano's rise to power was not just about the triumph of one man over another, it was about the triumph of order over chaos. Luciano understood that in order to gain control of the Mafia, he would need to destroy the old power structure and replace it with something more efficient, more organized. The old ways of the Mafia, built on constant violence, betrayal, and disarray, could no longer be sustained. By orchestrating the deaths of both Masuria and Maranzano, Luciano effectively wiped out the old guard and seized control of the Mafia. This was a turning point in the history of organized crime in America. For the first time, the Mafia had a leader who was not just focused on turf wars and extortion, but on building a cohesive, centralized organization. Luciano's vision was clear. He would create a criminal empire that operated like a business, with structure, hierarchy, and efficiency. The chaos that had defined the Mafia up until that point was gone, replaced by a new order, one where loyalty, discipline, and business acumen were paramount. Luciano's victory in the power struggle between Masuria and Maranzano marked the beginning of a new era in organized crime. It was a victory not just for Luciano but for the future of the Mafia. By consolidating power and eliminating the old guard, Luciano had created a criminal organization that could survive and thrive in the modern world. The Mafia was no longer a fragmented collection of crime families, it was a unified, centralized entity with Luciano at its helm. But the road to this victory was not easy. Luciano had to navigate a world of constant danger, where betrayal was always lurking around the corner. He had to deal with the ever-present threat of law enforcement, who were beginning to take a more serious interest in the Mafia's operations. And perhaps most challenging of all, he had to balance the delicate dynamics of the criminal underworld, keeping his allies loyal while simultaneously neutralizing his enemies. In the end, Luciano succeeded because he understood the psychology of power. He knew that in order to be successful he had to be more than just a mob boss, he had to be a mastermind. He had to be someone who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast his rivals. And it was this ability, this strategic genius, that would ultimately define Luciano's legacy. He didn't just rise to the top of the Mafia, he redefined what it meant to be a criminal kingpin. Luciano's early life, marked by hardship and struggle, prepared him for the chaotic world of organized crime. The fractured state of the Mafia, defined by infighting, betrayal, and violence, was the perfect backdrop for his rise. And it was through his vision, his cunning, and his ability to build alliances that Luciano transformed the underworld into a powerful, organized force. The world before Lucky Luciano was one of disorder and violence, but through his leadership the Mafia would never be the same again. Lucky Luciano's journey from a street kid to a towering figure in the criminal underworld was not a simple one. Born in 1897 in the slums of Palermo, Sicily, Luciano was thrust into a world defined by struggle from the very beginning. His family, like many others, emigrated to America in search of a better life, hoping to escape the poverty and violence that plagued their homeland. They settled in the tenements of New York's Lower East Side, a neighborhood that was both a melting pot of immigrant cultures and a hotbed of crime. For young Luciano, it was a harsh environment that would shape his character and set him on a path that would lead to infamy. From an early age, Luciano was no stranger to hardship. He grew up in a world where survival was a constant challenge, where every day was a struggle for food, shelter, and safety. His family was poor, and his parents, while hardworking, were often unable to provide the luxuries or security that many American families took for granted. But what they lacked in material wealth, they made up for in determination. They were driven by the hope that America would offer their children opportunities that would have been impossible back home in Sicily. However, for young Luciano, this dream often seemed distant, overshadowed by the harsh realities of his new life. Luciano's early experiences in America were marked by a constant tension between two worlds. On one hand, he was part of a large, close-knit immigrant community that shared his struggles. The Italian-American community in New York was a world unto itself, one where family loyalty and mutual support were valued above all else. On the other hand, he was also acutely aware of the discrimination and hostility that immigrants faced in America. The streets of New York were filled with hostility toward Italian immigrants, who were often looked down upon by the established American population. For Luciano, this created a sense of alienation, a feeling that he was an outsider in a country that he was supposed to call home. It was this sense of displacement and frustration that would drive Luciano toward a life of crime. He quickly realized that for many immigrants, crime was not just a way to survive, it was a way to gain respect and establish power in a world that often ignored or rejected them. As a young man, Luciano began to get involved in small-time hustles, running numbers, petty theft, and bootlegging. These early forays into the world of crime weren't about greed or ambition, they were about survival. Luciano understood that in the world of New York's underbelly, only the strong survived, and only those who commanded respect could hope to succeed. It didn't take long for Luciano to prove himself. He was a natural at the street game, and his keen mind and ruthless streak quickly set him apart from other young criminals. Where many saw crime as a chaotic, unorganized affair, Luciano saw an opportunity to create something more structured, more efficient. He recognized early on that the criminal world was a business, and like any business, it needed organization. He had the rare combination of street smarts and intellect that allowed him to navigate the world of crime with ease, earning him respect from his peers and fear from his enemies. Despite his early success, Luciano was not yet the man we know today. At this stage, he was just another ambitious young criminal trying to make a name for himself. He had yet to fully understand the dynamics of power, and his alliances were still tentative. But it was in his dealings with other young criminals that he began to form the relationships that would eventually shape his rise to the top. It was through these early partnerships that Luciano learned the importance of loyalty, strategy, and trust, lessons that would serve him well in the years to come. One of the key figures in Luciano's early career was Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant who would become one of his closest allies. Lansky, a Jewish gangster, had a mind for business and a talent for managing finances. Like Luciano, he understood that organized crime could be much more than a series of independent rackets. It could be an empire, a global operation that operated like a corporation. The partnership between Luciano and Lansky was a natural one. Lansky provided the financial acumen, while Luciano brought the muscle and the ruthlessness necessary to maintain control. As Luciano's influence grew, so did his ambitions. He began to see the potential for a larger criminal empire, one that could rival the traditional mafia families in New York. But to achieve this, he would need to confront the old guard, powerful figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the reigning mafia bosses who dominated the city. Both Masuria and Maranzano represented the old ways of doing business, relying on brute force and violence to maintain their power. Luciano, on the other hand, saw a more organized approach as the key to his success. He believed that the mafia could operate more like a business, one that could generate profits, minimize risks, and expand its influence beyond New York. It was this vision that set Luciano apart from his contemporaries. He wasn't just looking to run a few rackets, he wanted to create a unified, efficient criminal organization. He believed that the mafia needed a clear structure with designated roles for each member, and a system of checks and balances that could prevent internal strife and competition. It was a radical idea, but one that he was willing to fight for. To implement his vision, Luciano knew that he would have to eliminate the leaders who represented the old ways, the men who stood in his way. In the early 1930s, Luciano began to move against Masuria and Maranzano. The two men had long been rivals, each seeking to expand his control over the New York Mafia. Luciano saw an opportunity to capitalize on their rivalry, playing both sides against each other while slowly undermining their power. He began to form alliances with other mobsters who were dissatisfied with the old guard, including men like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. These men shared Luciano's vision for a more organized mafia, and they were willing to help him topple the established leaders. The struggle between Luciano and the old guard culminated in what would become known as the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that would reshape the entire mafia structure. Masuria and Maranzano, once powerful figures, were each assassinated by Luciano's men, and with their deaths, Luciano emerged as the new leader of the mafia in New York. But this victory was not just about eliminating two rivals, it was about creating a new order. Luciano's triumph marked the beginning of a new era in the mafia, one where power was centralized and loyalty to the boss was paramount. In the aftermath of the war, Luciano implemented his vision of a more structured, organized mafia. He established the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the operations of all the major mafia families in the United States. This move was designed to prevent further violence and internal conflict, and it marked a radical departure from the chaotic, disorganized ways of the past. For Luciano, the Commission was not just a power-sharing agreement, it was the foundation of a criminal empire that could operate with the efficiency of a corporation. With his new power, Luciano expanded his criminal empire beyond New York. He sought to establish control over all aspects of organized crime, from bootlegging and gambling to labor unions and trucking. Under his leadership, the mafia grew into a massive international enterprise, one that spanned the globe. Luciano's influence extended far beyond New York, as he established connections with criminal organizations in cities like Chicago, Las Vegas, and even Havana. But despite his success, Luciano remained a man of the streets, never forgetting where he came from. He continued to rely on his street smarts and his ability to read people, always maintaining a network of loyal allies and informants who helped him stay one step ahead of his enemies. His ability to manipulate people and situations, to forge alliances and break them when necessary, became one of his greatest strengths. As Luciano's power grew, so did his reputation. He became known as a man who could not be defeated, a criminal mastermind who could outthink and outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. His early life, filled with hardship and struggle, had forged him into a ruthless, cunning figure, one who understood the importance of loyalty, strategy, and power. But even as he rose to the top of the mafia world, Luciano never lost sight of the lessons he had learned as a young man. His success was built not just on violence, but on his ability to outsmart his rivals and create a system that could endure. Luciano's early life was a key factor in shaping the man he would become. It was in the streets of New York, surrounded by crime, poverty, and violence, that he learned the rules of survival. It was there that he honed his skills and developed the strategies that would help him rise to the top of the criminal world. And it was there that he first realized the true nature of power, not just in brute force but in control, organization, and the ability to bend the world to his will. As Luciano's influence grew, so did his ambitions. He was no longer satisfied with simply being a powerful figure in the New York Mafia. He envisioned something far grander. His mind, sharp and strategic, began to shape the idea of organized crime not as a chaotic mess of competing families but as a well-oiled machine, where each part of the operation worked in harmony for the benefit of all. Luciano understood that, just like any successful corporation, the Mafia needed structure, leadership, and a central command. What had previously been a fragmented network of loosely affiliated criminals was now poised to become a global criminal enterprise, run with the precision of a business operation. To understand the scope of Luciano's innovation, it's important to grasp the environment in which he operated. Before his rise, the Mafia was an entity defined by turf wars, rivalries, and chaotic power struggles. Each family operated like a separate, independent unit, often in direct competition with one another. Violence was common and alliances were fragile at best. The Mafia was not an organization, it was a collection of fiefdoms, each ruled by a kingpin who fought for dominance. This environment, while providing individual success for some, was unsustainable. It was a system that was bound to implode, especially as law enforcement began to take organized crime more seriously. Luciano, however, recognized an opportunity in this chaos. He had no intention of continuing with the status quo. Instead, he set about transforming the Mafia into something far more powerful and lasting. He believed in the potential of the criminal world to function with the same efficiency and precision as a legitimate business. This was his genius. He saw crime not as a world defined by random acts of violence, but as an industry, one that could be streamlined, standardized, and expanded into a global force. To begin with, Luciano understood the importance of eliminating the chaos that had previously defined the Mafia. The first step in creating a more organized criminal enterprise was to eliminate the old guard, figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who epitomized the traditional, chaotic Mafia structure. These men ruled with brute force, relying on fear and violence to maintain control. But Luciano knew that this system was inefficient and unsustainable. It created too many enemies, too much unrest, and far too many opportunities for betrayal. If he wanted to build something lasting, he had to remove the old guard and replace it with something more efficient. In what became known as the Castellamarese War, Luciano orchestrated the deaths of both Masuria and Maranzano, the two most powerful figures in the New York Mafia. Their deaths were a bloody and dramatic turning point, not only for the Mafia in New York but for organized crime in America as a whole. With their removal, Luciano cleared the way for a new era, one in which he would take control of the Mafia and impose his vision of order. But this was just the beginning of his transformation of the underworld. With Masuria and Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano set about consolidating his power. He realized that in order to maintain control over the Mafia, he needed to create a system that could manage the interests of multiple families, each with its own territory and criminal operations. The answer came in the form of the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the activities of the 5 major crime families in New York. The Commission was a groundbreaking idea, a centralized body that would settle disputes, allocate territories, and ensure that each family had a stake in the larger operation. This was the key to Luciano's vision of organized crime as a business. Instead of endless feuding, the families would work together for mutual profit, with Luciano at the helm as the ultimate authority. The Commission was a radical departure from the old ways of doing business. Under the previous system, family bosses would often settle disputes through violence, leading to bloody turf wars and unnecessary bloodshed. With the Commission, however, Luciano established a more formalized method for resolving disputes. The Commission provided a way for families to negotiate, trade, and cooperate, all while ensuring that no one family would dominate the others. The Commission was designed to keep the peace and maintain order, and it quickly became the backbone of Luciano's empire. By implementing this system, Luciano was able to establish control over the various factions within the Mafia, creating a unified criminal organization that was greater than the sum of its parts. But the Commission wasn't just about internal order, it was also about external expansion. Luciano's vision was not confined to New York City. He wanted to take the Mafia beyond the borders of the city and expand its operations across the country and eventually around the world. The Commission gave Luciano the ability to broker deals with other crime families, not just in the United States but across the globe. He reached out to powerful figures in cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and even Havana, forging alliances that would expand his influence and generate immense profits. The creation of the Commission also allowed Luciano to implement a more structured approach to the various criminal enterprises under his control. He divided the Mafia's operations into distinct areas: gambling, bootlegging, labor rackets, and unions. Each area was run by a trusted associate, someone who was loyal to Luciano and who could be relied upon to maintain order within their respective territory. By decentralizing the day-to-day operations of the Mafia, Luciano was able to focus on the larger picture, expanding his empire, managing alliances, and maintaining control over the entire criminal operation. Perhaps the most important of Luciano's innovations was his ability to think like a businessman. He approached crime as an enterprise, focusing on long-term profitability and sustainability rather than short-term gains. Under his leadership, the Mafia became far more efficient. Operations were streamlined, and the Mafia's influence expanded across the country and beyond. Luciano's ability to maintain a careful balance between control and autonomy within the different families was key to the success of his operation. Each family, while still having autonomy within its territory, understood that the larger goal was to ensure the success and survival of the whole organization. By making the Mafia a collective business venture, Luciano created a system that could survive the changing tides of the criminal world. Luciano's brilliance also lay in his ability to manage relationships. Unlike many of his predecessors who saw loyalty as something that could be bought through fear and intimidation, Luciano understood that loyalty had to be earned and nurtured. He cultivated strong personal relationships with key figures within the Mafia, forging alliances that were based on trust and mutual benefit. He was a master of diplomacy, knowing when to push and when to pull back. His ability to manage relationships within the criminal underworld was instrumental in his success. At the same time, Luciano was also aware of the external pressures that were beginning to mount on the Mafia. The rise of law enforcement, particularly the growing power of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, presented a real threat to his empire. Luciano understood that if the Mafia were to survive, it had to operate with a degree of subtlety and sophistication that would make it harder for law enforcement to infiltrate. He emphasized the importance of secrecy and discretion, knowing that the more visible the Mafia became, the more vulnerable it would be to attack. Despite his increasing power and influence, Luciano never lost sight of the street-level operations that had defined his rise to prominence. He remained involved in the day-to-day activities of his criminal enterprises, always maintaining a firm grip on his empire. He was a hands-on leader who understood the importance of maintaining control over his territories, while also being willing to delegate authority to trusted lieutenants. Luciano's empire was not just one of criminal activity, it was an organization that operated like a business, with employees, managers, and shareholders. Each territory, each racket, each operation was a part of the larger system, and Luciano was the mastermind who oversaw it all. His ability to organize, to manage, and to think strategically was what set him apart from his contemporaries and made him one of the most powerful figures in American history. The impact of Luciano's vision cannot be overstated. He fundamentally transformed the way the Mafia operated, creating a more efficient, centralized, and profitable system. His influence extended far beyond New York City, and his legacy would shape organized crime for generations to come. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia evolved from a loose collection of criminal families into a global enterprise that spanned continents and generations. His reign marked the beginning of a new era in the underworld, one where organized crime became a highly structured, business-driven operation, an empire that operated in the shadows, yet controlled much of the criminal activity in the world. The Mafia's code of omerta, a key pillar of its operations, was central not only to its survival but also to its sense of identity. This unwritten code was more than just a set of rules. It was a moral framework, a psychological contract between every member of the organization, binding them to an ironclad loyalty to the family and its leaders. Omerta wasn't just about silence in the face of law enforcement, it was about maintaining a culture of respect, honor, and strict loyalty within the organization itself. It dictated not only how members interacted with outsiders, but also how they interacted with each other, enforcing a sense of unity and discipline that was essential for the Mafia's strength. At its core, omerta was about silence and trust. The code demanded that members refrain from talking to the authorities, even under the most extreme pressure. This was not simply about avoiding legal repercussions. It was about protecting the family, maintaining its power, and ensuring its continued operation. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, one that could never be forgiven. In fact, within the Mafia, a snitch or traitor was considered lower than scum, a symbol of dishonor and weakness. The penalty for breaking omerta was severe. Death was often the only price for disloyalty. But the implications of omerta went deeper than just the threat of violence. It represented a unique moral code that governed the actions of every member of the Mafia. To break omerta wasn't just to violate a set of rules, it was to dishonor the very fabric of the organization. For a mafia man, the family was everything. It was not just a criminal network, it was a surrogate family, and loyalty to that family was paramount above all else. The idea of betrayal was not just about individual failure, it was about the fracturing of the entire criminal enterprise. Omerta thus served as a glue that held everything together, ensuring that personal ambition and weakness did not tear apart the carefully constructed empire Luciano had built. Omerta's influence extended beyond simply keeping members quiet in the face of law enforcement. It was a form of psychological control, a tool that bound people to the mafia's way of life. A key component of Omerta was the idea that the family's interests came first, above the interests of the individual, the community, and sometimes even personal morality. This hierarchy of loyalty ensured that each member of the mafia knew their place in the larger structure, and it fostered a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Omerta was not just a code of silence, it was a way of life, an ethos that governed every decision a mafia member made. At the psychological level, Omerta also acted as a form of social control. Members were not just loyal to the family because of fear, they were also loyal because they believed in the values the mafia upheld. The mafia's code provided a sense of order in a world that was often chaotic. In the streets of New York, where survival was a daily struggle, Omerta offered a sense of security, a guarantee that once you were part of the mafia, you were part of something larger, something invincible. It gave members a sense of pride, a feeling that they were part of an exclusive club with its own set of values that could not be easily understood or adopted by outsiders. In this way, Omerta created a world apart, a microcosm where loyalty and respect were the only currencies that mattered. Luciano, more than any other figure in the history of the mafia, understood the importance of this code. He knew that the mafia's strength lay not just in its ability to generate wealth but in its ability to function as a tight-knit, cohesive unit. Omerta was the glue that held his criminal empire together, and he ensured that it was enforced with strictness. Under his leadership, the mafia wasn't simply a collection of opportunistic criminals, it was a community governed by its own rules, its own sense of morality. To break those rules was to break the very foundation upon which the mafia was built. Yet Omerta, for all its power, was not without its contradictions. The code demanded loyalty, but it also bred suspicion. For a mafia member, maintaining Omerta often meant walking a fine line between loyalty to the family and self-preservation. Loyalty to the family was everything, but so was the desire to protect one's own life. In many cases, this led to a constant balancing act. Members had to keep their mouths shut and follow the rules, but they also had to navigate the dangerous waters of internal politics. One wrong move could lead to their own downfall. Luciano was acutely aware of these contradictions and he knew how to exploit them. He didn't just rely on Omerta to control his men. He used the code to maintain his own power, to create a sense of fear and reverence that made it difficult for anyone to challenge his authority. Omerta wasn't just about keeping secrets, it was also about keeping control. By enforcing this code, Luciano was able to maintain a level of discipline and loyalty within his empire that would have been impossible otherwise. But even Luciano's empire wasn't immune to the complexities of loyalty. For all the trust he had in his key lieutenants, there was always the underlying threat of betrayal. The mafia, like any criminal organization, was rife with competition and rivalries. Luciano's men were ambitious, and many of them harbored their own dreams of rising to the top. As much as the code of Omerta demanded loyalty, it also created an environment where that loyalty was always tested. Each betrayal, each whisper of discontent, threatened the balance that Luciano had worked so hard to establish. This tension between loyalty and betrayal was a defining feature of Luciano's reign. On the one hand, his ability to enforce Omerta and maintain discipline ensured that the mafia operated smoothly and efficiently. On the other hand, it created a climate of fear and suspicion that ultimately contributed to the internal struggles and challenges Luciano faced. The psychological weight of the code was always present, lurking in the background of every decision, every action. Omerta was as much about maintaining control through fear as it was about loyalty through respect. But the most profound impact of Omerta was how it shaped the identities of those who adhered to it. For a mafia member, to live by the code was to live a life of constant tension, constantly balancing loyalty to the family with the fear of being betrayed. Omerta created a world where the stakes were always high, where trust was both a weapon and a vulnerability. It made every decision more complicated and every relationship more fraught with danger. Yet, it was also a code that gave individuals a sense of purpose. The mafia's members weren't just criminals, they were soldiers in an ongoing battle for control, men and women bound together by a set of rules that transcended the chaos of their daily lives. Luciano, as the architect of the new Mafia, was a master of using omerta to his advantage. He understood that loyalty was the foundation of his empire, and he crafted his organization with this in mind. Every decision he made, every alliance he formed, and every battle he fought was shaped by the psychological weight of omerta. It was a tool for control, but it was also a way to unite his people. For Luciano, omerta was more than a code, it was the very essence of what the Mafia was, and it would remain so long after his reign ended. In the end, omerta was both a weapon and a prison, a source of strength and a source of tension. It allowed the Mafia to function as a powerful, centralized organization, but it also kept its members on edge, trapped in a world where loyalty was paramount, but so was survival. For Luciano, enforcing this code was not just a way to maintain order, it was a way to create an empire that would stand the test of time, an empire held together by the unbreakable bond of silence, loyalty, and trust. As Lucky Luciano's empire grew, so too did his vision of the Mafia's business model. He recognized early on that in order to establish a criminal empire capable of surviving and thriving in the modern world, he would have to transform the Mafia from a chaotic, fragmented network into a highly organized business operation. This would require a shift in how the Mafia conducted its illegal enterprises, moving from street-level operations to something that functioned like a corporation, efficient, systematic, and profitable. The world of organized crime under Luciano's leadership would no longer be ruled by brute force alone. It would be governed by strategy, profit margins, and sophisticated operations. One of the key areas Luciano transformed was the Mafia's approach to illegal trades. Gambling, bootlegging, smuggling, and union racketeering were not new to the Mafia, but under Luciano's direction, these activities would be elevated to an entirely new level. He saw the potential for these operations to be run like businesses, each with a clear hierarchy and a focus on maximizing profits while minimizing risk. The days of unpredictable street hustles and turf wars were over. The new model would ensure that the Mafia could generate consistent income while maintaining a low profile, especially in the face of increasing law enforcement attention. Take gambling for example. Before Luciano's time, illegal gambling was typically run by independent operators or small-time mobsters, often in direct competition with each other. There was no formal coordination and the results were chaotic. Constant infighting, turf wars, and an overall lack of efficiency. Luciano understood that to make gambling truly profitable, he would have to centralize it. He began by consolidating the various gambling rackets across New York, streamlining operations, and ensuring that each part of the operation was protected by a loyal enforcer. By creating this centralized structure, Luciano turned what had once been a disorganized collection of operations into a reliable and profitable venture. The gambling racket was no longer just a means of making quick cash, it became a cornerstone of Luciano's financial empire. But Luciano didn't stop at gambling. Bootlegging too was transformed under his guidance. The Prohibition era, which began in 1920, had opened up a massive black market for alcohol. Mobsters across the country had been smuggling and distributing alcohol for years, but the business was still largely fragmented. The competition was fierce, and while many profited, the instability of the system meant that money was often lost in the crossfire. Luciano, however, saw the potential for a more coordinated effort. He began to forge alliances with other criminal organizations, not just in New York but across the country, to create a more unified distribution network. His operations became more sophisticated, with trucks and warehouses being used to streamline the flow of illegal alcohol. Instead of a patchwork of small, disjointed operations, Luciano built a massive, centralized network that could control the flow of alcohol from production to distribution, ensuring a steady stream of revenue. Luciano also made significant strides in the world of labor racketeering. Unions were an essential part of the American economy, and by the 1930s, they had become a prime target for organized crime. Many mafia figures before Luciano had used violence and intimidation to take control of unions, but Luciano took a more strategic approach. He understood that unions were a lucrative way to secure influence over entire industries, from construction to trucking to manufacturing. By gaining control over unions, Luciano could extort businesses for protection money, influence contracts, and ensure that union members would be loyal to him rather than the companies they worked for. Luciano's approach was more calculated and less dependent on violence. Instead of relying on brute force, he used his charm, his business savvy, and his political connections to infiltrate unions. He established relationships with key union leaders, making sure that they understood the value of working with him. His influence over labor unions became a cornerstone of his empire, bringing in vast amounts of revenue and securing his grip on the most essential industries in the United States. One of the most impressive aspects of Luciano's business model was how he connected all of these ventures. Instead of having separate, independent businesses that functioned in isolation, he ensured that each part of the operation complemented the others. For example, the profits from bootlegging and gambling were often used to fund union activities and vice versa. The centralized nature of the operation meant that money could be moved around as needed to protect the most vulnerable parts of the organization or to expand into new areas. This kind of flexibility and adaptability was crucial for Luciano, especially as the pressure from law enforcement and rival gangsters continued to increase. Luciano also understood the importance of maintaining a low profile. He realized that in order for the Mafia to survive in a rapidly changing world, it couldn't rely solely on violence and intimidation. The old ways, characterized by public shootouts and overt acts of brutality, were becoming less sustainable. Law enforcement, led by the growing FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, was becoming more aggressive in its pursuit of organized crime. At the same time, the public was beginning to take more notice of the Mafia's operations, especially as figures like Al Capone became infamous. Luciano was a master at operating in the shadows. He knew that the key to surviving in the modern world was not to attract attention. While he was certainly not afraid to use violence when necessary, he preferred to operate through intermediaries and make his moves behind the scenes. His influence extended far beyond New York City. It reached into every corner of the United States and even overseas, where Luciano forged connections with criminal organizations in Havana and other parts of the world. He understood the value of discretion, and he was careful to keep his hands clean while still maintaining control over his empire. The way Luciano ran his business was a stark contrast to the old-school methods of mobsters like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. These men relied heavily on violence and intimidation, but Luciano believed in the power of organization and control. He was less interested in creating fear than in building an empire that could operate smoothly and efficiently. This approach allowed him to build lasting relationships, not just within the Mafia but with political figures, law enforcement officials, and businessmen. By maintaining a more businesslike approach to crime, Luciano was able to make the Mafia more adaptable, more resilient, and ultimately more powerful. One of the key elements in Luciano's ability to run such a large and diverse criminal operation was his delegation of power. While he was undoubtedly the leader, he understood the importance of surrounding himself with a team of capable, loyal individuals who could run the day-to-day operations of the various aspects of his empire. He delegated authority to trusted lieutenants who managed gambling, bootlegging, and unions, while he focused on the larger strategic vision. This decentralized approach allowed Luciano to maintain control over the entire operation without being bogged down in the minutiae of each individual business. Luciano's ability to delegate also extended to his ability to manage his relationship with other crime families. The commission, which he created to unify the various Mafia families, was a key part of this strategy. Rather than allowing the Mafia to be torn apart by internecine conflict, Luciano created a system where the heads of each family could come together to resolve disputes, share profits, and ensure the overall success of the organization. This level of cooperation and organization was unprecedented in the history of the Mafia, and it allowed Luciano to control not just his own family but the entire Mafia structure. In many ways, Luciano's vision of organized crime was a precursor to the way large corporations are run today. He understood that success was not just about muscle and violence. It was about building a system that could function efficiently, generate consistent profits, and adapt to changing circumstances. He treated crime as a business, and in doing so he revolutionized the way the Mafia operated. His business acumen, combined with his ruthless ambition, made him one of the most successful and influential crime bosses in history. By the time he had consolidated his power, Luciano had transformed the Mafia from a fragmented, chaotic group of criminals into a highly organized, efficient, and profitable global enterprise. His business model would serve as a blueprint for future generations of mobsters, who would continue to operate with the same principles of organization, loyalty, and strategic thinking that Luciano had established. In the world of organized crime, Luciano's legacy would remain unmatched. His ability to turn crime into a sophisticated, international business set him apart from all who came before and after him. As Luciano's influence expanded, he found himself facing not only external threats but internal ones as well. The underworld was, after all, a world built on power struggles and fragile alliances. Despite his ability to consolidate power and create a business-like structure within the Mafia, the rivalries, betrayals, and ambitions of others continued to pose significant challenges to his reign. The dynamics of the Mafia were often a delicate balancing act. Maintaining loyalty was crucial, but so too was navigating the treacherous waters of competition and power grabs. As Luciano's empire grew, the tension between these forces began to build, and ultimately, the stage was set for the most significant crisis of his career. The Mafia at its core had always been about power. Each family operated like a small kingdom, ruled by a boss who commanded loyalty and respect. The very structure of the Mafia meant that there could only be so many kings in the same kingdom. Luciano, however, wasn't satisfied with merely being one of many bosses. He wanted to be the king of all Mafia kings. And in the process, he had to contend with both the personal rivalries that were an inevitable part of the underworld and the shifting tides of power as new figures emerged to challenge his dominance. It was in this climate of rising tension that Luciano's greatest adversary would emerge, Vito Genovese. Genovese, a powerful and ambitious figure in the Mafia, had long been a trusted lieutenant of Luciano's. However, like many in the criminal world, Genovese had his eyes set on the top spot. He was a man driven by personal ambition, one who believed that he could do better than Luciano at running the Mafia. It wasn't long before he began to plot against his former mentor. Genovese's betrayal was the first real challenge to Luciano's reign. While Luciano had always known that there would be rivalries and power struggles within the organization, he had believed that his leadership and his ability to maintain control over the various families would allow him to remain at the top. But Genovese's ambitions were different. He wasn't content to be a second in command. He wanted to lead the Mafia himself, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. The two men, once allies, were now locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Genovese working behind the scenes to undermine Luciano's authority. The feud between Luciano and Genovese wasn't just a personal one, it had serious consequences for the entire Mafia. As Luciano's former protégé, Genovese knew the inner workings of Luciano's empire. He understood how the system was structured and how Luciano had created a balance between the families. This gave him a significant advantage in his quest for power. He began to sow dissent among Luciano's lieutenants, playing on their fears and insecurities, and slowly eroding Luciano's support base. Genovese's machinations were subtle but effective, and soon, Luciano found himself surrounded by those who were loyal to Genovese, not to him. But Luciano was no stranger to betrayal. He had risen to power through cunning and ruthlessness, and he wasn't about to let Genovese's ambitions destroy everything he had built. Luciano quickly realized the gravity of the situation. He knew that Genovese's challenge to his authority could not be allowed to go unchecked. If he failed to act decisively, the entire structure of his empire could unravel. And so, in true Luciano fashion, he began to respond with a combination of diplomacy and force. Luciano's strategy was to keep his enemies close and his allies closer. He knew that Genovese's power base could be undermined, but it would require careful maneuvering. Luciano wasn't interested in all-out war, at least not yet. Instead, he worked behind the scenes to weaken Genovese's support by leveraging his own network of loyalists and by playing on the rivalries between the different factions within the Mafia. He knew that Genovese's ambition made him a dangerous opponent, but Luciano also knew that, like most ambitious men, Genovese was prone to mistakes. If Luciano could exploit those mistakes, he could neutralize the threat. It was in the midst of this internal strife that Luciano faced an even greater external challenge: the increasing pressure from law enforcement. The federal government, particularly the newly empowered FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, was becoming more aggressive in its efforts to dismantle organized crime. Luciano had built an empire that spanned the globe, but he was also under constant surveillance. The government's crackdown on the Mafia was intensifying, and the threat of incarceration was a constant shadow over Luciano's operations. In 1936, the government dealt a significant blow to Luciano's empire with his arrest. After a lengthy investigation, Luciano was charged with compulsory prostitution, a charge that was designed to cripple his operations and remove him from the leadership of the Mafia. The case against him was solid, and despite his best efforts to stay out of the authorities' reach, Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The arrest was a catastrophic moment for Luciano, one that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. But even in prison, Luciano proved that he was far from finished. His ability to maintain control over his empire, even while incarcerated, was a testament to his organizational genius and his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The conviction may have placed him behind bars, but it did not diminish his influence. Luciano's network of loyalists remained intact, and his power within the Mafia continued to be strong. He used his time in prison to maintain his control, giving orders through intermediaries and ensuring that the operations of his empire continued without interruption. His ability to stay in charge from behind bars was a testament to the structure and strength of the system he had built. But despite his ability to maintain control, Luciano knew that his position was precarious. The internal power struggle with Genovese continued, and the external pressure from law enforcement was mounting. The government's case against him was solid, and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence loomed over him. Yet Luciano never lost sight of his ultimate goal, to maintain control of the Mafia and secure his legacy. In 1942, Luciano was offered an unexpected opportunity. The U.S. government, in need of assistance during World War II, approached him with a deal. The government was seeking intelligence on the movements of Axis ships along the East Coast, and Luciano, with his extensive criminal connections and knowledge of the waterfront, was in a unique position to help. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano was offered a deal that would grant him a commuted sentence and ultimately lead to his deportation to Italy. Luciano accepted the offer, understanding that this was his chance to regain his freedom and secure his place in history. The government's deal, while controversial, was a pragmatic decision, born out of the need for intelligence during a time of global conflict. Luciano's cooperation with the government marked a dramatic turn in his career, a shift from being a criminal mastermind to a man who could operate in the world of politics and international intrigue. His release from prison in 1946 marked the end of his time in America and the beginning of his life in exile. Luciano was deported to Italy, where he would spend the rest of his days. Despite his return to his homeland, he was never able to regain the same level of control over his empire as he had in New York. The Mafia, however, continued to thrive, and Luciano's legacy remained intact. He had built a criminal empire that transcended borders, and while he may have been physically removed from the game, his influence continued to be felt across the globe. Luciano's legacy was complex. He was a man who had reshaped the Mafia, turning it into a more organized, business-like operation. His ability to adapt, to manipulate power, and to maintain control even in the face of immense adversity was extraordinary. Yet his life was also marked by betrayals, power struggles, and the constant tension between loyalty and ambition. He was a figure who lived by the rules of the underworld, but whose life was ultimately shaped by the larger forces of law and politics that he could never fully control. In the end, Luciano's story is a tale of power and survival, of a man who built an empire from the ground up and fought relentlessly to maintain his dominance, even when the odds were stacked against him. His legacy, while controversial, has endured, and his influence on the world of organized crime is undeniable. Though he was ultimately exiled, his name would forever be linked with the golden age of the Mafia, and his story would remain one of the most compelling chapters in the history of American organized crime. As the layers of Luciano's life unfold, his journey into the darker corners of his empire reveals not just the heights of his success, but also the depths of his most dangerous battles. His rise to power had already established him as the undisputed leader of the Mafia, but it was the hidden wars, the conflicts both within the underworld and with the forces outside it, that defined the latter part of his reign. These battles were more than mere power struggles. They were about survival, loyalty, and the very existence of the criminal empire he had worked so hard to create. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's Mafia had evolved into something far more complex than its predecessors. It was no longer just a loose collection of independent crime families engaged in petty turf wars. Under his rule, the Mafia had transformed into a sophisticated, global operation with an intricate network of criminal activities, ranging from bootlegging and gambling to labor racketeering and smuggling. But with power came enemies, and for every alliance he forged, there were those who resented his rise or saw him as a threat to their own ambitions. The first of these internal battles began after Luciano's removal of the old guard, particularly the elimination of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. While these moves had consolidated his power, they also left behind a sense of instability. In the wake of their deaths, rival factions in the Mafia sought to fill the power vacuum, setting the stage for the birth of new rivalries and personal vendettas. Many of Luciano's closest allies became competitors, as they too sought control over the vast criminal empire Luciano had built. Even within the framework of the Commission, the governing body Luciano had established to maintain order and resolve disputes between families, tension was inevitable. Every decision made under the Commission's guidance affected the balance of power, and it was only a matter of time before one of the families decided to break the fragile peace. One of the most critical moments in this period came with the emergence of Vito Genovese as a serious challenger to Luciano's dominance. Genovese, a man who had long been loyal to Luciano, began to quietly build his own base of power, slowly eroding the support of Luciano's closest allies. By the late 1930s, Genovese's growing influence within the Mafia was impossible to ignore. He was a highly ambitious and capable figure, one who felt he could achieve greater success by taking control of the family. His plotting against Luciano was both calculated and ruthless, and he soon found several key figures within the organization willing to join his cause. For Luciano, this betrayal wasn't just an affront to his leadership, it was a personal challenge. Genovese was once his trusted lieutenant, someone who had benefited from his mentorship and guidance. The realization that a man whom Luciano had once trusted was now working to undermine him was a deep wound, one that would come to define the hidden war that raged in the shadows. The underworld, after all, was not just a business, it was a community bound together by trust, loyalty, and fear. The breaking of those bonds was something that Luciano could not afford to ignore. As Genovese's plotting gained momentum, Luciano found himself forced to navigate this dangerous internal war while also dealing with the mounting pressure from law enforcement. The government, recognizing the growing power of the Mafia, had begun a concerted effort to bring down its leaders. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was targeting the Mafia with increasing intensity, and it was clear that Luciano was at the top of their list. In many ways, the external battle with law enforcement was even more perilous than the one within the Mafia itself. While Luciano was certainly capable of handling the rivalries and betrayals within his organization, the threat posed by the government was far more complicated. It was not a war fought with bullets and muscle, but with intelligence, surveillance, and relentless legal pressure. The federal government's campaign against Luciano culminated in his arrest in 1936. The charges against him were serious. He was accused of running a prostitution ring that spanned much of New York City. While Luciano had always been involved in a range of illegal enterprises, the charge of compulsory prostitution was one that the government believed would bring him down once and for all. They had been building a case against him for years, and in 1936, they finally succeeded in securing a conviction. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a sentence that, at the time, seemed like the end of his reign. The verdict was not just a personal defeat for Luciano, it was a momentous event in the history of organized crime, one that sent shockwaves through the entire Mafia. But even behind bars, Luciano proved that he was far from finished. His influence within the Mafia did not wane with his imprisonment. If anything, it grew stronger. He maintained control over his empire through intermediaries, communicating with his lieutenants and making decisions from the confines of his cell. His ability to remain in command even while incarcerated spoke volumes about the system he had built. Luciano's empire was not merely based on violence and intimidation, it was based on organization, loyalty, and a network of relationships that extended far beyond the prison walls. In many ways, Luciano's time in prison became a testing ground for his ability to navigate the ever-changing dynamics of the criminal world. While he was incarcerated, his enemies within the Mafia, led by Genovese, continued to grow in power. However, Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with, even from behind bars. His ability to maintain his control over the commission and other key Mafia figures was a testament to the strength of his organization and his leadership. Luciano had always been a strategic thinker, and his time in prison only sharpened his ability to manipulate the levers of power. During this period, however, Luciano's future was far from certain. The external pressure from law enforcement, combined with the growing internal conflict with Genovese, created an environment of instability. It was clear that, unless Luciano was able to regain his freedom, his empire would be vulnerable to collapse. The government's crackdown on organized crime was relentless, and it seemed as though they were closing in on Luciano's every move. It was at this juncture that Luciano's fortunes began to change. In 1942, as the United States entered World War II, the government turned to Luciano for help. With the country at war, the U.S. government was desperate for intelligence on Axis shipping and the activities of the enemy along the East Coast. Luciano, with his extensive connections to the waterfront and his deep understanding of organized crime, was in a unique position to provide that information. The government, recognizing his value, offered Luciano a deal. In exchange for his cooperation, they would commute his sentence and allow him to return to Italy. Luciano's decision to cooperate with the government was a dramatic turn in his career. For a man who had built his power by operating in the shadows, working with the authorities was a bold and controversial move. But Luciano understood the significance of the opportunity. By cooperating with the government, he could regain his freedom and secure his place in history. In return, the government promised to release him from prison and eventually deport him to Italy. Luciano's cooperation with the government marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, he was released from prison and deported to Italy. While his empire in the United States had been severely weakened by his incarceration, Luciano's influence in the Mafia continued to be felt across the globe. He may have been exiled, but his legacy as the architect of the modern Mafia was secure. In the years that followed, Luciano's life in Italy was marked by a different kind of struggle. He found it difficult to regain the same level of power that he had once held in America, but his status as a revered figure in the Mafia ensured that he remained an influential force. Though he was no longer the central figure in the Mafia, his legacy lived on, and his innovations in how organized crime was run continued to shape the criminal world long after his death. Luciano's story is one of power, betrayal, survival, and adaptation. His reign as the most powerful Mafia boss in history was not defined by his victories alone, but by the internal and external struggles that shaped his life. From his rise to power through the elimination of his enemies, to his complex relationship with his lieutenant Genovese, to his ultimate arrest and cooperation with the U.S. government, Luciano's life was a constant battle to maintain control and secure his legacy. His ability to navigate the challenges of both the underworld and law enforcement speaks to his strategic brilliance and his unyielding determination to survive, no matter the cost. Luciano's downfall began when law enforcement finally succeeded in putting him behind bars, but the story of his fall is not merely one of losing power, it is a tale of betrayal, manipulation, and the complexities of survival in a world governed by violence and loyalty. His arrest in 1936 was not only the culmination of years of investigation but also a brutal reminder of the precarious nature of even the most powerful criminal empires. Luciano, who had so skillfully evaded the law for years, suddenly found himself trapped in a web of his own making, his every move scrutinized by a government determined to dismantle the Mafia. Luciano had built his empire on the pillars of secrecy and cunning, keeping his hands clean while his lieutenants carried out the more violent and illegal aspects of the operation. But in the end, it was his own ambition that led to his downfall. The charge that would eventually bring him to trial, compulsory prostitution, was a carefully orchestrated move by the authorities. The government had long been investigating Luciano for his involvement in various illegal activities, but prostitution was the charge they believed would stick. It was a crime that could be prosecuted effectively, and one that carried serious consequences. Despite his attempts to shield himself from direct involvement in his criminal enterprises, Luciano could not escape the fact that, as the head of the Mafia, he was ultimately responsible for the actions of his underlings. The trial was a public spectacle, a media frenzy that further fueled the myth of Luciano as the kingpin of organized crime. It was a trial in which the government and the media sought not only to convict him but to make an example of him. A message that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For Luciano, the trial was a bitter moment of reckoning. He had spent years building an empire based on secrecy, and now he was thrust into the spotlight, his every move dissected by reporters and prosecutors alike. But for all the drama and spectacle, Luciano's downfall was not solely the result of law enforcement efforts. It was also the product of internal rivalries, particularly the betrayal of his trusted lieutenant, Vito Genovese. Luciano's fall from grace was not just about the government's efforts to take him down, it was also about the people he had once trusted turning against him. Genovese, a man who had benefited from Luciano's mentorship, had quietly begun plotting against him in the years leading up to his arrest. Genovese saw Luciano's position at the top of the Mafia as a barrier to his own ambitions, and he was willing to do whatever it took to take over. His betrayal, while not the sole factor in Luciano's downfall, certainly played a significant role in destabilizing his empire. As the trial went on, Luciano's grip on his criminal empire began to weaken. The infighting between the families escalated, as Genovese and others jockeyed for position. Luciano's absence created a power vacuum, and the structure he had carefully built started to crumble. His lieutenants, once loyal to him, began to fracture, each pursuing their own interests as they sought to fill the void left by their incarcerated leader. What Luciano had carefully constructed, a mafia that was more of a business than a street gang, was now being torn apart by the very forces of greed and ambition that he had tried so hard to control. The trial itself was a battle of its own. The government had a solid case against Luciano, but the defense was equally determined to paint him as a scapegoat, a victim of overzealous prosecutors looking to make an example out of him. The legal battle was one of attrition, a test of endurance and resources. Luciano, despite his criminal brilliance, was caught in a system far beyond his control. The legal system was a game he could not win. As the months dragged on, his once unshakable confidence began to erode, replaced by the cold reality of his situation. For the first time in his life, he was vulnerable, exposed to forces that he could neither intimidate nor control. Despite his best efforts, the jury found him guilty in 1936, and Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentencing was not just a personal blow, it was a blow to the very system he had built. The trial was a symbolic victory for law enforcement, but it was also a deeply personal loss for Luciano. For a man who had once seen himself as untouchable, who had built an empire that spanned the globe, the verdict was a humbling moment. It was the moment when everything he had worked for began to unravel. But even behind bars, Luciano's ability to maintain control over his empire was a testament to his brilliance. Unlike many mafia leaders who lost all influence once they were incarcerated, Luciano managed to remain the de facto head of the mafia even from his prison cell. His prison sentence did little to diminish his power, and his network of loyalists continued to carry out his orders, ensuring that his criminal operations remained intact. Luciano had built a system that was not dependent on his physical presence. It was a system that functioned through loyalty, trust, and carefully planned hierarchies. He continued to direct operations through his trusted lieutenants, sending instructions and maintaining his control over the various arms of his empire. In a way, Luciano's time in prison allowed him to cement his legacy as a master strategist. From his cell, he played the game of power just as he had done on the streets of New York. He knew how to manipulate the system, how to use the political forces at play to his advantage. Despite his imprisonment, Luciano remained an influential figure within the mafia, and his reputation continued to grow. He had built something that was much larger than himself, an empire that could not be easily destroyed no matter how much law enforcement or his enemies tried. However, Luciano's legal troubles were far from over. The authorities were not content with merely convicting him, they wanted to break him completely. His conviction was a victory for law enforcement, but they knew that as long as Luciano remained active within the mafia, he would continue to be a threat. He had already demonstrated that even from prison he could exert tremendous influence, and the government sought to eliminate that influence once and for all. They began to push for his deportation, hoping that by removing him from the United States, they could cripple his operations. In 1942, during the height of World War II, the government saw an opportunity to strike a deal with Luciano. Desperate for intelligence on the Axis powers, the U.S. government approached Luciano with an offer. If he cooperated and provided information about Axis shipping and the movements of enemy forces, they would release him from prison and allow him to return to Italy. For Luciano, the offer was too good to refuse. It was a chance not only to regain his freedom but also to secure his legacy as a man who had operated on the edges of both the criminal underworld and the world of international politics. Luciano agreed to cooperate with the government, providing valuable intelligence on the movements of German and Italian ships along the East Coast. His cooperation with the government marked a dramatic shift in his life, a shift from being a criminal mastermind to a man who could now navigate the corridors of power, both in the world of organized crime and in the world of international diplomacy. His deal with the government was a pragmatic one that allowed him to continue to influence the mafia from a distance while also securing a future for himself outside of prison. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy. He had been exiled from the country he had spent most of his life in, but his legacy as one of the most powerful figures in the history of organized crime remained intact. Though he was no longer in control of the mafia in the United States, his influence continued to shape the world of organized crime for years to come. Luciano's exile was the final chapter in a life filled with power, betrayal, and survival. A life that had begun with a street kid's ambition and ended with a man who had reshaped the criminal world in his own image. Luciano's downfall, though marked by his arrest and imprisonment, was not the end of his story. It was a chapter that revealed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful figures in the underworld. But it was also a testament to his resilience. Even in the face of defeat, Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with, and his legacy would live on long after his exile. He had built an empire that had transformed the mafia into a business, one that would continue to thrive for generations to come. The courtroom was a battleground not just for the future of the mafia, but for Luciano's legacy. The trial that convicted him was more than a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle that attracted public attention and media frenzy. It was not just about proving a crime, it was about establishing a symbol. Luciano was the figurehead of organized crime, and bringing him down would be a triumph for the government and a victory for those who believed the underworld's reign needed to end. In many ways, the trial was the final chapter of Luciano's empire in America. One marked by public humiliation, a legal system that saw him as a criminal to be destroyed, and a crushing realization that his days of absolute control were over. The charge that led to Luciano's conviction was compelling, and it struck at the heart of his criminal empire: compulsory prostitution. Though Luciano had always been known for his involvement in a wide range of illicit activities, from bootlegging to labor racketeering, the prostitution charge was the one that the government believed they could nail him on. It was a crime that allowed them to target the very foundation of his operation. With the investigation building over the years, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to bring him to trial, making it clear that his reign was finally under siege.